By the time the major prophets are writing in the Old Testament, the Abrahamic covenant has a layer of meaning that's about hope for restoration, especially during exile. Ultimately, in the New Testament, Paul adds this brand new layer of meaning to say that everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, can be the spiritual heirs of Abraham because of how that covenant was fulfilled by Christ. If you go back in time and just look at the original covenant, there is no layer of meaning about Christ visible. It's about land and generations to come and blessing the earth. That's what the original covenant is about. But by the time we're in the New Testament, Paul is explaining to us this is about Christ. Christ made it so that all get to participate in this covenant. Welcome back to Come Follow Me with Fair. My name is Jennifer Roach Lees. Today we are going to talk about Abraham. We are in Genesis 12 through 17. This is week 8 of Come Follow Me. This week is actually kind of part 2 to what we started last week. So let me go back a little bit. Pause and go listen to it if you haven't. That might be the better thing to do, but I will sum up for you. We talked about the covenant God made with Noah, and how it might be easy to think of covenants as this static thing that never should change and never should have new layers of meaning. But that's not really how covenants are presented to us in Scripture. And so today we're going to pick up that same idea with covenants, and we're going to talk about the covenant God makes with Abraham. So last week we were talking about the meaning of covenants and how meaning is revealed over time. And for some people, that might feel kind of frightening or like a problem, or it worries them. But it's part of how our church views the world. It's part of our theology. It's part of our belief that revelation is ongoing, that these things are being unfolded over time. Last week's episode will give you all the details on that. Here's where we're going this week. At different times in Scripture, different meaning has been put on things like, say, Noah's covenant, the Noahic covenant. Sometimes it's about a literal flood of the earth. Other times it's about God promising that his mercy will outlast his anger. Other times it's about obedience bringing righteousness. At other times it's about accepting suffering, just like Christ did. And each time a scripture writer talks about this covenant, they are not erasing the previous meaning. They're adding to it. The covenant does not change with each new scripture passage. It's just expounded upon. So we come to Abraham and the covenant God makes with him. And the Abrahamic covenant, it's introduced in Genesis 12. It's expanded in Genesis 15 to 17. It's this very pivotal moment in biblical history and in Christian history where God initiates this lasting promise with Abraham and his descendants. The covenant includes 3 parts. God promises him land, the assurance of countless posterity, as numerous as the stars, and a declaration that Abraham's children and Abraham's seed will bless all nations of the earth. So God chooses one man and says, I'm going to bless the entire earth through you and your children. And he says that to him in a moment when Abraham has no children. It's this amazing, wonderful story. The covenant is both conditional. It involves Abraham's faith and obedience, and it's everlasting. It kind of forms the backbone of the theological identity of frankly, the world's major religions over history. Jews and Christians and Muslims get much of their origin story here. It establishes a relationship not just based on divine favor, like in Noah's covenant. God makes a covenant to Noah, and there's no conditional part of what Noah has to do. It's just God saying. But here, it's not just based on God's divine favor, but a mutual commitment to each other. But just like the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham gets new layers of meaning added to it over time. In Genesis 22, so just a few short chapters from where we are now, we're going to see Abraham asked to sacrifice his son. And this is almost right after God promised him that his posterity would be as numerous as the stars. And while the Abraham sacrificing his son story is a very complicated story, and we will get there when we get there. We gain a layer of meaning here to the covenant that is going to be fulfilled. And it's going to require Abraham to trust God to keep his word, even when that seems logically impossible. So we have the initial covenant. God says, I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you children, and through that, the entire world is going to be blessed. The very next time God is talking about this covenant with Abraham, he puts Abraham to the test, a test that most of us might not pass. And he changes. God adds some additionalness to this covenant that Abraham has to trust God that he's going to do what he said. We could go on. By the time the major prophets are writing in the Old Testament, the Abrahamic covenant has a layer of meaning that's about like hope for restoration, especially during exile. Ultimately, in the New Testament, Paul adds this brand new layer of meaning to say that everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, can be the spiritual heirs of Abraham because of how that covenant was fulfilled by Christ. Now, if you go back in time and just look at the original covenant, there is no layer of meaning about Christ visible. It's about land and generations to come and blessing the earth. That's what the original covenant is about. But by the time we're in the New Testament, Paul is explaining to us this is about Christ. That Christ made it so that all get to participate in this covenant. You and I can kind of squint at the Abrahamic covenant and see the undertones of Christ in that, but only because we know, only because we stand on this side of history and can look back and see it. Certainly, no one in Abraham's day would have said, oh yes, this is about Christ. The fact is that meaning has been layered onto this covenant over time, making it richer and wider and more inclusive than it was before. The changes to it are not a problem. They're the whole point. The truth is revealed over time, and we see that even in the scriptures. So we, as Latter-day Saints, we come from this rich tradition of ongoing revelation. And I want to take a moment and show how Joseph Smith handled ongoing revelation, because he was restoring the church, but he was also adding wonderful new layers of meaning, not only to what it means to be a church, but to our covenants as a whole. He's doing it exactly like the writers of Scripture are doing it. This next section comes from a paper I wrote for FAIR. It's on the FAIR website, From Sinai to Salt Lake. It's from 2025's Old Testament conference. You can read it online. It's pretty nerdy. It's written in a more formal tone than I'm going to talk about it to you right now. But if you're interested in more details or following some footnotes, that's where you can find that. So how did Joseph both restore the ancient church and expand on our ancient covenants? So there's a book, Rosanne Benson. Her book is Alexander Campbell and Joseph Smith, 19th Century Restorationists. So nerdy. But Benson is fantastic. I think it's incredibly researched, really, really well presented. Rosanne has presented at Education Week a number of times. If you've attended that, I would recommend going to her class, absolutely. But she discusses this dynamic by contrasting Joseph Smith with another religious figure of his day, Alexander Campbell. Now, Campbell also considered himself to be someone who was called to restore the true church on earth. They're contemporaries. They're living at the same time. Their two visions are almost entirely different, though, in what does it mean to restore the true ancient church. Campbell favored this sort of minimalistic, rationalist restoration. And his idea was, if you strip Christianity down to the absolute bare bone essentials, you will have the essence of what the ancient church was. So his was a restoration of like distillation. He's distilling everything down into only what is absolutely required. Benson says Alexander's restoration views focused on a rational and reasoned interpretation of the scriptures through the lens of Enlightenment philosophy, while Joseph Smith approached restoration through what in the 19th century was called enthusiasm. And you'll see what she means by this. So Campbell believed his restoration would bring Christianity back to the practices of, sometimes they call it the primitive church. You might call it the ancient church. Benson says again, a restoration of ancient order of things is all that is necessary to the perfection and happiness of society. That's what Campbell believed. So he's on board in a sense with the church needs to be restored and it's going to bring happiness and perfection to society. He just thinks it should be restored complete bare bones. And by this, what Campbell means is there's a limited number of things that must be present for the church to function. And there is no need to add any more than these limited number of things. And he emphasized Scripture alone, which is a very, very sort of Protestant idea that you can get all truth that is needed for your faith from Scripture. And by that, they would mean the Old and New Testament. So Scripture alone, baptism, and observing the Lord's Supper weekly. We would call it sacrament. They might call it communion or the Lord's Supper. So those, like that's his deal. Scripture alone, baptism, sacrament. In his view, almost nothing else was needed. That those three things alone could restore the church to what it had been in ancient days. His restoration was to take the church back to its absolute bare essentials without any superfluous ideas or practices. And Joseph Smith could not have viewed restoring a church any more differently. In one sense, Campbell was using the term restoration in its most obvious form. He's trying to bring back something that had been lost. That's how he sees himself. He looks back and sees these practices, says, I want those again, and he wants to bring those forward to his current day. However, Smith's version of restoration was, as Roseanne Benson put it, expansive, imaginative, and revelatory. Not only did Joseph want to bring back ancient priesthood and covenants and temple worship, he wanted to introduce new ideas, new scriptures, add new verses, as it were, to the song which began in the original covenants in ancient days. But for a modern people, this is actually really, really well illustrated in his expansion on the Abrahamic covenant. So during the Kirkland Temple dedication, Joseph received priesthood keys from Elias, who committed the Abrahamic promise to him, enabling the gathering of Israel and the sealing of families. You know the story really well. The original Abrahamic covenant promises that Abraham's seed would spread throughout the earth and that through him all people would be blessed. And Joseph takes this covenant and specifies exactly how that is to happen. And that is through the sealing ordinances. So it's only hinted at in the original promise to Abraham, through you all peoples on the earth will be blessed, and that your seed will be as many as the stars in the sky. That becomes specific through Joseph Smith. So we have to go back to the question, what was Joseph doing when he restored the idea of covenants? So the idea of covenants was already really well known in Joseph's day. That's not a new term. He didn't invent it. He didn't introduce it. It's well known to people of his day, and that can be shown through many, many examples in writings and sermons of the era, books. I have a few footnotes in the paper I referenced on this if you want to see that. When Joseph spoke about covenants, when he was alive, he was speaking into an already well-established understanding of them. But when God spoke of the Noahic covenant in Isaiah 54, we talked about this last episode, he is also speaking into an already well-established idea about what the Noahic covenant meant. The people of Isaiah's day would have easily retold the story of Noah, and they could have given appropriate commentary to the exact meaning of that covenant. And then, like roughly 1,500 years later, God brings up that covenant again and adds new meaning to it. Everyone supposedly knew exactly what that covenant with Noah meant, except for that they didn't. God had more to add. 700 years later, he gives more meaning through Peter and the writer of Hebrews. No one living in Israel prior to Isaiah would have articulated that the Noahic covenant was about the relationship between God's mercy and his anger, or that it was about baptism or righteous living or suffering. They would have expressed the original meaning of the Noahic covenant, which was that God was promising not to flood the earth ever again. But the meaning of the covenant does not stay static. God adds layers and nuances as the circumstances demand. It is as if God is writing new verses to the old song. Same tune, new verse, some expanded meaning. And when Joseph Smith begins talking about the restoration of covenants, we still ask, what is it exactly that is being restored? Can I look back in Scripture and point to something that has stayed exactly the same? No, you can't. It isn't simply that Joseph discovered an old text, dusted it off, and called it restored. That does not seem to be the case. Instead, what Joseph is doing is participating in this grand tradition of Scripture. He allows God to use him to add a new verse to an old tune. The tune is the covenant, but there's more to be added to it. Joseph adds a new verse. And while God was certainly able to establish his covenants in Scripture, he still speaks in our day. He didn't just speak in Scripture. He speaks in our day and continues to bring layers of meaning to those promises. Joseph is not actually just restoring old covenants. He's helping to co-create them, just like these writers in Scripture did. It is my meditation all the day to know how I shall make the saints of God comprehend the visions that roll like the overflowing surge before my mind. Oh, how I would delight to bring before you things which were never thought of. That's from Joseph Smith. He is very aware that he is adding to this wonderful tradition he is stepping into. And he's not just restoring. He's not just dusting off some old documents. He's not even just translating some old documents. He's bringing new information, new life into them. He's expanding them. That's the beauty of what the restoration is. Joseph Campbell's version of the restoration, pare it all down to the tiniest, most essential bits possible. It's rather small in comparison. The idea that Joseph have is no, we are going to take everything and we're going to keep expanding. And at the end of the day, that's our belief as a church, that God continues to speak to us, that he continues to reveal things to us. Next week, we'll get further into Abraham, the birth of Isaac and God's command to sacrifice him. It can be a really upsetting story, but all this talk these last 2 weeks about covenants is going to help us find our way through that. It's actually going to be really good and fascinating. I'll see you then.